Okay, hello again, everybody, and welcome to the second half of the recorded material dealing with the years leading up to the American Revolution. When we finished in our last session, we were looking at the Stamp Act, which is in many respects the instigating factor of resistance and ultimately rebellion among the colonists. Certainly there had been other kinds of things happening in the years prior to 1765, but the Stamp Act is seen by a lot of historians as being kind of the watershed moment in a lot of this. So Parliament is saddled with tremendous debt as a result of the French and Indian War. They need to pay that off. And unfortunately, the British public, which is already burdened with some pretty significant tax responsibilities themselves, the British public says, no, we're not going to pay any more, which means then that the British government needs to look elsewhere. And probably the most profitable, the most valuable colonial possession in the British Empire would be the American colonies. And so naturally Britain decides, well, we will tax the Americans for them to help pay some of the burden of this debt that we are carrying. The Americans are already not paying the same amount of taxes as other parts of the empire, but they perceive the actions of the British government as being a violation of their rights as British citizens. And so that's really where the revolution begins. The revolution doesn't begin because Americans are saying, we deserve to be treated differently. The Americans are actually saying, strange as it is to believe, the Americans are actually saying, we want to be treated like British people, and you are not treating us that way. So the revolution isn't a matter, especially in the early years and in the buildup, it's not a matter of the Americans saying, how dare you treat us this way? We're Americans, we deserve to be treated better. They're saying, we are British citizens just like anybody else, you can't treat us as though we are not, which seems hard to fathom given the most common narrative of the American Revolution. But that's a false narrative in a lot of ways. So, Stamp Act. Stamp Act is resulting in an increasing amount of resistance and more often violent resistance. And so Parliament decides it's going to be more expensive for us to, and more damaging to us, to continue the Stamp Act and risk the further erosion of relations between the two sides. We might as well just repeal it, just get rid of it. So the Stamp Act is repealed March 18th, 1766. At almost exactly the same time, Parliament passes what's called the Declaratory Act. Now, this is a law or an act, a statement, basically, that says Parliament has the right to govern the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. In other words, Parliament here is reminding the colonies, right? This isn't Parliament creating this power out of thin air. This is Parliament saying, we have always had this power, and now we are going to remind you in no uncertain terms that just because you don't like a law that Parliament passes, that doesn't give you the right not to follow that law. Parliament is the deciding sort of body in all legislative matters regarding the British Empire, and that's just the way it is. So from now on, Americans, you will abide by any law that Parliament passes. Again, this is not Parliament creating this power for themselves. This is Parliament saying, we have always had this power, perhaps you have forgotten that, but we are reminding you of that fact. So Parliament still needs money, right? They can't just say, well, you know, Stamp Act didn't work, we'll just live with this debt. So they decide on a different approach. They decide on a very traditional kind of taxation, which is customs taxes, right? Duties on certain products that are going to be imported and exported to and from the colonies. And so these taxes apply to a number of different items: paint, tea, paper products, right, all kinds of things. So this, on the one hand, is going to help Parliament raise money to pay down that debt. And on the other hand, it is a deliberate kind of attempt to say, yes, we got rid of the Stamp Act. We recognize that probably was handled badly in a general sense, but we still have the power to collect revenue taxes, and we've established that or reminded you of that in the Declaratory Act, and here's the Townsend duties as a reassertion of that power, of that right. The Americans largely ignored the Declaratory Act, and the Americans have decided, look, we don't agree with the Townsend taxes either, so we will boycott. This boycott is fairly successful, to the point that most of those taxes are repealed by 1770. And once again, Parliament is left kind of holding the bag, right? How do we raise this money, given that the American colonists are so recalcitrant, they're so resistant to the idea of taxes? What do we do? Well, things, briefly at least, start to get even worse before they get better, and then they will get even worse again. So how does that process happen? Well, in 1769 and 1770, England has decided that Boston is really kind of the flashpoint of a lot of this agitation. And they decide we need to kind of clamp down on Boston. We need to send a message not only to Boston itself, but also kind of send a message to the other colonies that resisting these taxes is not acceptable. These kinds of boycotts, this kind of black market smuggling operation to avoid the taxes, no, not okay. So they send 4,000 soldiers to Boston, which is bad enough because this is basically about 40% or 50% of Boston's total population, right? Boston has a population of probably 12 to 15,000 at the time. So this is a significant number. That's bad enough, but in addition, soldiers in the 18th century are professional, but only to a point. So when you're off duty, not that soldiers in the American Army today go off duty in this same way. Soldiers in the British Army at the time, when they're off duty, they can look for other work. And Boston is already in an economic downturn. And suddenly you have thousands of additional potential laborers who are competing with Bostonians for those jobs. This is an accident waiting to happen. And March 5th, the afternoon and evening of March 5th, that really does come about, right? So March 5th, 1770, there is a small mob that gathers. It's a long story, we unfortunately don't have time to go into it in a lot of detail. A small mob is gathering to protest the fact, different stories about what's going on, to protest the fact that a British soldier has failed to failed to pay for his wig, which sounds absurd in 2020, but although I guess in 2020 anything would sound absurd. So it sounds absurd to us today, but it is a serious problem because it points out the kinds of tensions that exist between the British presence in Boston and the local population. So this mob gathers, follows this guy back to the customs house, which is kind of the symbolic representation of British infringement on American rights. And they begin pelting the guard detail at the customs house. They begin pelting this detail with rocks, bottles, snowballs, that kind of thing. The captain of the British Guard, a man named Thomas Preston, orders his soldiers into a skirmish line. Basically, that's 2 lines of 4 or 5 people, one kneeling, one standing, as more of a show of force than anything. A musket or a pistol is accidentally discharged. Most likely, somebody was nervous and just fired out of anxiety and fear, or somebody tripped and fell, their finger pulled the trigger, and off goes the weapon. By the end of it, 5 people are killed, several people are injured, and it becomes the Boston Massacre. At the time, people in Boston recognize that this is a very prickly situation. They put the people on trial. They put Preston and 8 of the soldiers on trial. All but 2 of them are acquitted. The 2 who are convicted escape death by way of a kind of legal loophole at the time. Partially, the trial was because the acquittal was because people recognized the extenuating circumstances. The eyewitness accounts made it clear that Preston was trying to get his soldiers to stop firing. Partially, though, this was also a recognition that if Boston severely punished any of the soldiers involved, that this would probably result in an even more aggressive action by Britain than already was going on, right? It's bad enough to have 4,000 soldiers in your town. It would be made even worse if there was any perception that the justice system was not even-handed in dealing with the people involved in the Boston Massacre. So, yes, the Boston Massacre is a significant moment in the build-up to the American Revolution, but it's going to be another 5 years between the massacre and the shots at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. So how does that process come about? Well, partially it comes about because certain figures in the colonies use things like the Boston Massacre as propaganda tools. And this is probably the most famous image of the Boston Massacre, the shooting in Boston. And it is filled with historical inaccuracies. And these are inaccuracies that people, even at the time, knew about. But if you weren't in Boston, if you weren't privy to the transcripts of the court proceedings during the trial of Preston and the soldiers, you wouldn't know what happened in Boston. So people who knew about the event knew that this is not an accurate portrayal of what happened. But people living elsewhere in the colonies would see images like this. They would read descriptions, exaggerated and overblown descriptions in newspapers, and they would take those kinds of things as being the gospel truth. And so agitation surrounding the British in North America, in the American colonies, is partially a result of deliberate attempts by especially people like the Sons of Liberty to kind of manipulate the story in a certain direction, right? A direction that paints the British as, in the case of this image, bloodthirsty murderers. Oh, sorry. And so those kinds of propaganda images and stories are really going to inflate Americans' sense of outrage about things like the Boston Massacre. The next significant step towards the revolution is going to be the Boston Tea Party. So certainly we're skipping over some years here or there, and that's just the nature of kind of doing the survey version of American history. In reality, America between 1770 and 1773 is fairly calm, to the point that there are people like Samuel Adams who are worried that the momentum of resistance that had been building in 1766, 7, 8, 9, and especially 1770, worried that that momentum was sort of evaporating, right? And concerned that the moment to really push for more aggressive kinds of reforms with regard to Britain and Parliament's power over the colonies, that moment had gone. Well, Britain, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, Britain was all too capable of undermining its own success, right? So in May of 1773, Parliament passes a law called the Tea Act. Now, most people think, oh, well, Boston Tea Party, Americans were angry because, Britain had raised taxes on tea. And that's actually the exact opposite of what the Tea Act was all about. The Tea Act actually lowered taxes on the tea that Americans were drinking. But the crisis comes not because of the cost of the tax, but because the Tea Act was designed to try to give the British East India Company basically a monopoly to sell its tea in the colonies at a much lower rate and without any competition, basically. And the Americans say, this is totally unfair. The British East India Company was a huge, huge corporation, kind of the Amazon of 18th century Britain. They have an enormous stockpile of tea that they can't sell, and they're in danger of collapse. And so Parliament says, well, what we'll do then is we will allow the East India Company to sell its tea in America for less money than other tea providers. We will put a small tax on that tea, so Americans will be getting tea for less than they would be paying for it otherwise. Who could possibly see a problem with this? And the East India Company will be bailed out. Everybody wins. The Americans, though, say, you have no right to undercut American manufacturers. In addition, the Tea Act includes a provision to be more rigid in enforcing anti-smuggling attempts or efforts, right? Lots of Americans were getting tea from the black market. The Tea Act says no more. You're not going to be able to do that any longer. And Americans decide, how dare you try to put a stop to our illegal activities? You have no right to do that. And so that's another part of the resistance to the Tea Act. So during the night of December 16th, 1773, probably about 60 people, some of them dressed as Mohawk Indians, they board British ships in Boston Harbor, and they throw overboard about 350 crates of tea. So the value of the tea financially isn't tremendous, right? It's not as though tens of millions of dollars worth of tea have been destroyed, but the symbolic nature of this, right? The destruction of property, the outright illegality of what they're doing makes it a much more impactful thing than just the value of the tea itself. Interestingly, there are a number of Americans that disagree with the Tea Party, the destruction of the tea, as it's known, and people even like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin say this is not what American resistance, or this is not advancing the American cause. Parliament is furious. Parliament says we need to send a very clear message to Boston in particular, but to the colonies in general, that these kinds of actions will not be tolerated. And they do a number of different things. For one, they decide to severely restrict Massachusetts's government. They install a general to be the governor of Massachusetts, a man named Thomas Gage. They pass a series of what they call Coercive Acts, which will close the port of Boston until the value of the tea is repaid. As I said, it severely restricts Boston and Massachusetts's government. It forces the quartering of British soldiers in public buildings, and if public buildings aren't available, it will force private citizens to house British soldiers in their homes and feed them and do their laundry and all of those kinds of things. And it says any royal official, whether this is a soldier or a tax collector or a governor or anybody, if they are accused of a crime in Massachusetts, they can choose to be tried outside of the colony, either in a different colony or even in England. So it's completely undermining the operation of the court system within Massachusetts. Americans call these the intolerable acts, right? Clearly, both sides are naming them based on what they see them as. The British call them the Coercive Acts, trying to coerce Massachusetts back into line. The Americans see these as completely intolerable and unacceptable laws and restrictions on the freedoms and the rights of Americans, again, the rights of Americans as British citizens, right? So what's the result? Well, the British believe that the Coercive Acts are going to sort of shock Massachusetts back into line. They see these as a punitive, right, punishment of Boston and Massachusetts for sort of unacceptable behavior, but it's also meant to kind of send a message to the rest of the colonies to say, look, don't test us. We will respond as forcefully as necessary in order to ensure that the colonies understand their position within the empire. It backfires. Rather than breaking the spirit of Massachusetts and Boston and scaring the other colonies straight, it actually turns Boston into a martyr. It makes the other colonies worry if they would do these kinds of things to Boston and to Massachusetts and react in this way, what might they do to us, right? And resistance then is going to ramp up dramatically in 1773 and 1774 to the point where the colonies actually, for the first time, create their own colonial government. This is the first Continental Congress. It's fairly short-lived. It will be replaced very quickly by the Second Continental Congress, which, as we will see when we talk about the Revolution itself, the Second Continental Congress is the body that will actually function as the government of the colonies during the Revolution. But the First Continental Congress lasts for a few weeks in the fall of 1774. It meets in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the largest city in the colonies. It's fairly centrally located. There are a lot of advantages to Philadelphia as being kind of technically sort of the first capital of the colonies in a lot of ways. The First Continental Congress doesn't do a whole lot. What it does do, though, is it says we will organize what's called the Continental Association, which is going to be the kind of committee, the part of Congress that will oversee colonial resistance. And the first thing that they decide to do is, once again, a boycott, right? The American reaction to most of Britain's attempts at legislation, the American reaction tends to be centered on economic measures, right? Boycotts. The Americans still have not gotten to the point of armed resistance. That will happen by the spring of 1775. And so most of the reaction is still along the lines of how can we get England to understand our position? How can we convince England that our rights as British subjects are being violated? We are not, certainly, at the point of independence. Yes, there are a growing number of people who are suggesting that as a possibility, or as, in some cases, maybe the only solution. But for the most part, the American colonists are still reluctant and refusing the idea, in many cases, that independence is the way out. So when we talk about the Revolution, we're going to have to keep in mind that the Revolution in reality is a very different thing than the way people typically sort of quote-unquote know about the Revolution. And so we have to look at it as a very particular thing and look at it in historically accurate terms. So that's going to be our next section. Let me know if you've got questions about any of the recordings, about any of the full PowerPoints on Blackboard. And our next topic then is going to be the Revolution itself. What it is, how it happens, how it ends, and what some of the background in terms of philosophy, in terms of motivation, in terms of meaning really are. So until then, I hope everybody does really well, and I will see everybody soon.